all the other stuff. They just let sort of the solutes and some sort of plasma proteins cross. And so that's basically what it is. It physically supports the brain, contains neurometabolites, and allows chemicals to reach specific areas of the brain, which is pretty interesting, because if you think that some drug enters your brain area, like it's going to touch all the areas that are bathed in cerebral spinal fluid first, before it gets to any of the more internal regions. So there's a picture. So basically the brain is not like a dense solid thing, there's a hole in it, and the hole is called the ventricle, and it's all connected. So they call them ventricles because there's like, anyways, they're all connected. So lateral ventricles is the site where this place called the choroid plexus sort of starts secreting out some of this fluid, and then that fluid isn't really pumped, it just sort of passively flows around your brain. So it passively flows lateral to interventricular, third, fourth, aqueduct, and then into this space, the subarachnoid space, which also bathes your spinal cord. And that's sort of the flow, and then it just diffuses back into your blood. And as I said, they are separate systems from your regular circulatory system. There's a blood-brain barrier and a blood-cerebral spinal fluid barrier. And so like a lot of drugs that you take don't even get to your brain until after a certain point. And that's because that there are these specialized cells that aren't letting things through except what can come through by the transporters that exist in them. It's a physical barrier, as I said, so they need specific transporters to send those molecules across. But it's also a metabolic barrier in that some things won't even come across. They'll be metabolized in and then spat back out into the cerebral spinal fluid. So the drug that's circulating in your blood might not necessarily be the drug that's circulating in your brain. Okay, cool. Structural organization. The brain is basically functional localization. As I said, different areas mean different things. They perform different functions. And it's really interesting because like you can see like the function of this might physically connect to a brain that functions like, or to a region of the brain that functions like this, sort of like examples. But anyways, we're still mapping out all that sort of stuff. The most general way I would like to explain it to you is through cortical regions and subcortical regions. So the cortex is this big outside, wrinkly looking area, and it's huge in humans, and we'll talk about it first. It's a 6-layer structure thought to be the seat of consciousness, whatever that means, because there's a huge debate on what exactly is consciousness, and that's a philosophical debate as well. Anyways, seat of consciousness, 3 main types of projections exist. So basically, this is all this information goes into the cortex, some wacky magic happens, and then output goes out, and then it's controlling us. But of course, that output is also filtered, so the input and the output is both filtered through the subcortical areas, which we think we don't have conscious control over, but we might. Cortical association neurons project to the same side cortex. So that's basically the same side hemisphere talking to the same side hemisphere. That's how like computers work, right? It's like everything in the same chipboard, they're all talking to each other. But there are two hemispheres in the cortex, and they're connected by a structure called the corpus callosum. So that's just like a huge like bundle of fibers that runs across. So you have 2 sort of computers in your brain, both figuring something out. And finally, descending projection neurons. And those ones are the ones that are going to go all around your body or to other subcortical regions. And those might carry directions, those might carry directions. That's basically what I'm saying. And finally, voluntary actions are initiated in the cortex. I think this much we know. And so when you actually do end up deciding to do something, the first fire is there in the cortex, and then it goes out. And then the action happens. Or it doesn't happen, because maybe it gets filtered. Okay, so this is going to read like a list, and I'm so sorry. But I think it's interesting, just get some of these words in your head. So thalamus receives sensory and motor signals. It has relay nuclei and diffuse nuclei. So relay nuclei mean that information coming from your eyes or whatever go here and then go to your cortex. So the big question is, why does it have to go somewhere else first? Like, what sort of connections does the thalamus have that's going to change that type of information so it could be understood or decoded in your cortex? Who knows? Or, well, I mean, someone might know. I just don't know. And it links many subcortical projections to the cortex. So you'll find that a lot of these things that we say, encode for like survival behaviors, like the feeding process and those sort of things we don't really consciously think of all the time. They usually come through the thalamus and then they go to the cortex. So maybe the cortex is sort of just, or the thalamus is maybe sort of decoding them in a way that the cortex can understand. The hypothalamus, together these two parts of the brain form an area called the diencephalon. I don't know if you'll know that, but the hypothalamus, we think of, like, there's a lot of feeding stuff that comes out of the hypothalamus and also temperature control and some sort of things. Basically, it receives information from the cortex and it initiates and regulates endocrine secretions, so those are hormones from your pituitary gland, and autonomic controls. So like, you've probably learned about this. Sympathetic nervous system and parasympathetic nervous system. So like, what we associate with fighting and flighting, and one that we associate with resting and relaxation. And basically, this is the part of the brain that actually physically controls those areas. So just like how the cortex has projections that come all the way from up here down to a muscle, this structure, the hypothalamus, has the same sort of projections that come all the way up here down to your like stomach and down to this. But like the most interesting thing, of course, is that there's crosstalk between this and the cortex. So like, when we say that we can't control, those autonomic functions, well, indeed, there may be some control because the cortex is attached to that area. However, there's probably no control of reflexes or like peristalsis because there's a whole system that that takes care of that, and it's entirely isolated from the central nervous system, and it's called the enteric nervous system. And then, so anyways, so we can't control those sort of things. So I think. The cerebellum, big flowery thing at the back of your brain, it receives information from the limbs and senses and seems to compare those two sort of, influencing the output of cortical spinal projecting neurons. So let's say you want to move somewhere, right? Like I want to move this forward. Well, like there's a lot of factors that you don't actually think about when you're moving forward, like the weight of your body, like how you're placing this. I mean, you could think of those things, but normally you don't. And so they find if you like lesion this area of the brain, like a lot of studies, by the way, are done by lesions. They just like poke it and then they say it's broken, and then they see like how you're different, and they're like, oh, that's why, that's why. Anyway, so like if you lesion that part of the brain, you're going to have really shaky, uncoordinated movements, and so that this is how they know that that function. Receive some signal from association cortex, allowing intent to influence motion. I thought that was really interesting. That says that maybe memories and emotions might stop us from doing certain actions. Okay, brainstem, medulla, pons, and midbrain. It receives most of the head information, like jaw, eyes, moving around like this. This is all controlled by the brainstem. It also has all the tracts, all the neuron bundles passing through it because it is like at the base of your brain, so it's the gateway to the rest of your body. Yeah. Oh, something important is that the hypothalamus connects to very important nuclei in the brainstem that release serotonin, responsible for mood. I think people call this like the reptile brain, like feeding and sex and all that sort of stuff. Anyways, it's there. And the limbic system. So there's a sensory system that people can map out by saying input, output. There's a motor system, input, output. But there's also this other system that they found in the brain, and they're like, oh, it doesn't map to any of the senses or the motors, so what could it be? And they found that lesioning this area often results in defects in learning, memory, and emotions. So cortical and subcortical regions that are at the border of those two areas, and somehow they do that. This one's really interesting because of all the places of your brain, they're the ones that have the most interconnectivity. So like they're the ones that say like they don't go to other parts, they just connect to themselves. And so like I think that's very interesting, indicating some sort of processing going on there. Okay, simplified model. So speaking about structure always leads to function. I think that's very important in biology, and that's why I'm doing this talk. That the structure of things tells you how it works, or should. Anyways, but as you can see, like this is a terribly complex structure, and so maybe for your purpose it might be easy to think of it as a computing organ, right? Like it's so easy to talk about computers. Computers are so simple. Like they have input, they have output. We've designed all of those sort of networks that work out. Of course it gets very complicated. I know nothing about computer science, but I'm saying it's more easy when you think about it compared to this. So you can think of a computer organ. Like this could be like a transistor. It has multiple inputs going in, and then it spits out an output of some way. And of course, there's going to be conflicting inputs, and that's going to generate sort of a computational result. I guess the interesting thing here is that the networks itself evolve so that there's this idea of plasticity, there's this idea of learning, that perhaps sometimes you can turn off certain firing patterns just by the experiences that you have, just by certain events that happen in your brain will influence the outcome of your behavior. So, as a computing organ, here's the easiest way to think of it. Information is gathered through receptors that enters the brain by ascending sensory pathways. There's a filter. The inputs are modified based on the regions of the brain nuclei that they pass through. And then finally, your output is generated by who knows what force. But that output again is filtered and then moves to the rest of your body. Okay, so that's like really simple, like in, out. But actually, oh my god, it's like much more complicated than that, because they've been mapping pathways and tracks all of this time, because this is a very interesting area of research and AI and stuff, right? Like, what if we could make a computer that had all these connections? Would it be the same? And I have no idea. They don't even know. Okay, complications and confusions. 3 main questions you can still ask about this that I love to ask every day, and also especially during altered states of experiences. It's very fun. How can we give sufficient explanations using regions if they demonstrate such widespread interconnectivity? So like they do all these lesion studies. They like poke this area and they say it doesn't work and now you don't work. But they've also shown that you can adapt to that you can still live with this lesion, that like other systems compensate for what's happening. And I think that's really interesting. That implies some sort of redundancy. And if that redundancy exists, can you force that redundancy consciously? Anyways, I'm a big mind over matter fan, and that's why I say those sort of things. What are the assumptions made in experimental techniques such as fMRI, which map out brain functions? This is a very scientific question, because, as I say, like it's always good to question the methodology. Like, how do we know exactly that increased blood flow in that area is actually mapping to the functions? How do we know that the baselines, because like there's always blood flow there, they have to do some sort of control to remove sort of the background information. How do we know that baseline is the proper baseline technique? How do you know when you're not thinking about those things as you're going through the baseline? Anyways, you can't really say those sort of things. And then of course, like sort of my area of research, what is the true nature of the diversity of neural connections, neural identity, firing patterns, neurotransmitters? They're all systems. And the biggest thing about this system that we don't know about is we don't know all the components. And so how can we make like, statements about behavior and stuff when we don't know those components? Okay. References. All very good books. I really like this one. And of course Wikipedia and all the pictures that you saw were taken from the internet, and I'm not referencing them. And finally, if you have any questions, I just want to leave you with the fact that, this is all great. I really like talking about this because it gives everyone a way to explain in very concrete ways what might be happening to you at any point in time. So that's like within any experience that you may go through, it gives you a really good way. But like at the same time, extremely confusing. I stole this from the internet. Like you look at that picture and like it looks weird, like you know what it actually is, but like you perceive something else. And so like I really just think that's sort of the human condition sort of idea, but that's what we're all working to explain. I'm sure this one actually has been explained already, so not that confusing. Does anyone have any questions? Okay, but you can just talk to me later. Oh yeah?
About synapses.
Yeah.
So you had that image like this.
Mm-hmm.
Is there ever like a 3-way intersection, or like 5 or 6 all coming together at the same time?
Oh, I'm not sure. I'm pretty sure that's not the case. Like what does happen though is that like you remember the soma cell body. It has multiple dendrites, and so there's going to be synapses all along all of those dendrites. So in terms of like multiple inputs, there's so much inputs coming in. So then the question is like, what are the thresholds of inputs that you need to initiate output? And then, so not like that, but more like it's all attached to one single body and then goes. Anything else? Okay, well, if you have more questions or want to discuss things, thank you very much for your time.